Hi everyone, this is Ms. Bastido, here to cover the ecology unit, specifically topic 2 in QCE biology. This will take a few different videos, so this will sort of be a part 1 of functioning ecosystems, and then we will move on to part 2 and maybe even a part 3. We'll see if we can get it all into 2 videos. That's not too long. And so we're just going to jump right in here. So I'm going to move myself around so you can see what you need to see on this slide. When we talk about energy and ecosystems, there's sort of 2, and you learned this in maybe grade 8 or 9, about energy transformations versus energy transfers. And so the difference between that is energy transformation being that one form of energy is being converted to a different type of energy, whereas energy transfer, it's the same energy just being transferred somewhere else, but in the same energy form. And so we'll first start talking about autotrophs. So autotrophs, remember, they are producers. Producers are typically plants, although they don't have to only be plants. And they transform, most of them, not all of them, but most of them transform light energy. And you can see that here in this picture, that they transform light energy into chemical energy. The chemical in photosynthesis would be a carbohydrate, specifically sugar or glucose, that then can be transferred into another form of chemical energy, such as a starch or something like that. And so while you don't, you learned in Unit 1 a little bit about photosynthesis. So it's really important that we know this equation, understanding that light hits the chlorophyll. The chlorophyll then absorbs the light energy. Carbon dioxide is taken into the plant, and water is taken up through the roots. And that combination of CO2 and water in the presence of light produces a sugar, and it also releases oxygen as a byproduct of that. And in the cycle of the carbon cycle, this releasing of oxygen is super important for heterotrophs that we're going to talk about in a minute. And so most autotrophs will transform light energy into chemical energy. And this is transformation because we're going from light energy into a chemical energy, this chemical being carbohydrates. There are a few organisms deep down in the ocean that do, instead of doing photosynthesis, do a process called chemosynthesis. And this is essentially using sulfur compounds as their energy source. So in this case, they're transferring the chemical energy into a different type of chemical energy. But these are not common, and so we don't talk about them that much, but it's just kind of nice to know that everything doesn't come from light, but almost every food chain, the basis for it is light energy. So then we'll move on to the heterotrophs. So heterotrophs come in lots of forms, and we also think of them as consumers. They have to feed on another organism in order to get their energy. And they all do this in different ways. So in this case, they're transferring chemical energy into chemical energy. There is a transformation that we'll talk about later, but for right now, we'll just say that they are transferring the chemical energy that they're eating into other chemicals in their body to build their body. We also know that they will transform some of that into heat, which we'll get to in a bit. So first we have herbivores. These are all things you've heard of before, but just to quickly go through them, herbivores are only eating producers, and so we call them first level consumers. And an example of that would be a koala eating the eucalypt leaves, and very specific in what they eat. We'll talk about that later. Carnivores are only eating other heterotrophs. So example would be, example would be the copperhead snake. This is the Australian copperhead snake. So they are only eating other animals. Omnivores obviously would eat both plants and animals, and a bilby is an example of that. Detritivores, and lots of students will get confused between a detritivore and a decomposer. So I always think a detritivore is eating dead organic matter, but it is actually eating. And so the earthworm is our most common detritivore that we talk about, found in really healthy soils. You'll find earthworms eating through the soil, and that soil goes through them, and they do digest that internally. A decomposer is different, usually a fungus or a bacteria that doesn't eat as we think of it. They will release some sort of enzyme to break down a chemical and then ingest what's been broken down externally. And so they don't have an internal system for digesting. Instead, they digest externally and then take in those nutrients. And then lastly, we have scavengers. Scavengers are a type of carnivore, but specifically, they're not hunting anything. Instead, they find things that have already been hunted and they will eat them. One example is a vulture. We don't really have vultures here in Australia, but vultures are a very common example of a scavenger. Hyenas are examples of a scavenger. So any of those. So all of these organisms plus plants do a process called cellular respiration. So we know that plants, the autotrophs, most of them are doing photosynthesis, but even the plants, but also all of these consumers are doing cellular respiration. And so this is the exact opposite equation to photosynthesis, with the exception of, instead of sunlight, we're producing ATP energy, which is sort of the usable energy in the cell. And so they will, whatever they eat, it eventually gets converted somehow to glucose. We won't go through that process. And then they breathe in oxygen and then release carbon dioxide and water and ATP energy that's used in the cells. One way that we can measure the amount of matter of an organism in a given area is by measuring the biomass. And so bio means living, mass obviously is the actual mass of the living organism. And so we can measure it by wet biomass or dry biomass. The problem with measuring wet biomass is it's really hard to compare different species biomasses based if it's wet, because all species will carry a different percentage of water in their body. And so the better way to measure biomass is through dry biomass, and that's putting it basically in a really low grade oven and letting the water evaporate, and that gives us the dry biomass. And then you can really compare different species because we've taken the water out of the equation. So with those different organisms that we spoke about earlier, we have here's a food web. So a food web is made up of many food chains, and there's a few things to notice about this. So funny, this actually says it's a simplified food web. So look at it. It doesn't look that simple, but this is a simplified food web, and they've omitted decomposers in the food web is what they've said. So here at the bottom, we would always put at the bottom our producers. And so they've listed different kinds of producers. Some of these are very general terms like aquatic plants or herbs and grasses instead of naming species, but that's okay. And so all of these would be our herbivores. And then here we have some on this next level, we have these, those are producers at the bottom. I think I said they were herbivores. These are producers at the bottom. And then right above that, we have all of our herbivores eating these producers. These producers then will be eaten by other organisms up here. Some of these are both, like for instance, if you look at the musk ducks, they eat small aquatic animals, which makes them a carnivore, but then they also eat aquatic plants. So because of that, they are omnivores. And so when we talk about what level they are in, we'll talk about trophic levels in a minute, but at the base, when you do a food web, you always want to put your producers at the bottom, then try to put your herbivores, and then it gets a bit complicated with omnivores because they can be connected to multiple things. There is also to notice like the amount of energy that an organism is getting. We'll talk about that in a minute, but it does depend on which trophic level they're eating in. So we have the bottom trophic level here, and then so this would be our producers are always in the first trophic level, and then our herbivores are in the second trophic level. Occasionally our omnivores will be in the second trophic level depending on what they're eating. And then as you go up, you have the third and fourth, and could even have fifth and sixth. It's not really common to have that, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The other thing to note when you're doing a food web is to make sure that the arrows are going in the direction of the energy transfer. So I always think, who's getting the energy? Who's doing the eating and getting the energy? They get the arrow pointing towards them, because we always want to draw the arrow in the direction of energy transfer. So food webs are a model for showing how energy transfers in an ecosystem, and that's what we were just looking at. But another model is energy pyramids, or you could see pyramids of biomass, or you might even see pyramids of numbers. So this one is a pyramid of biomass, and this one's of energy. The one that looks like an actual pyramid is not typically very accurate. As you can see, like if this is 100% of the energy and then only 10% goes here, we're not really representing the 10% very well. And so we represent it a little bit better here. And so what you'll see is, we call this the rule of 10. It is not 10% for every organism. It varies by species, what percentage of energy they're able to get out of the food that they consume. But we just sort of say in a general way, as a general rule, we'll say 10%. And so if there's 15,200 kilograms, and usually this is in kilograms per meter squared per year. And so if that is how much grass is here, then that could support 1,520 kilograms per meter squared per year of grasshoppers. And so that's just 10% of that number. And then of the mice, it would be 152 kilograms of these grasshoppers could be supported by these grasshoppers. And for the snakes, it would then be 10% of that. And so you can see here in the other, this is like an aquatic ecosystem. We have phytoplankton, which is our producers mostly in the ocean. And so here you have 1 million kilograms per meter squared per year, and then you have zooplankton. And so you have a lot more phytoplankton in the ocean. And so it might actually, that is one of the reasons we might have longer food chains in the ocean with more levels, although we're not showing as many levels in this one. And so the question then is, what happens to this energy? What is the efficiency as we move up to the food chain? And so what happens to the energy as we move up is that most of it, the large majority of it, is used as respiration. And then during our cellular respiration, we release a lot of heat. And so that heat then gets released to the environment. There is also an idea of like uneaten parts. So you eat an orange, you might not eat the peel. I assume most of us don't eat the peel when we eat an orange. And so because of that, we say that we didn't really consume the whole primary producer. And so that could be another part of it. And then lastly, some of it goes out to the decomposers in the environment to recycle the nutrients back. And so this is through defecation. It could be for a plant, like a leaf could fall off the tree, and that sort of thing. And so that goes into the ground, the decomposers will break it down, and then it goes back into the environment as well. The decomposers will also release their own heat through their respiratory processes. And so you also have some release of heat here, which is not in this diagram in particular, but you will see it. I think in the next diagram, I'll show you that. So these are the 3 ways that we can lose the energy. And we say lose, it's not lost, it's just released in a way that doesn't get added on to our bodies. And so when we say there's 100 kilograms per meter squared here and only 10 kilograms per meter squared here feeding on that. And that's because the other 90% we're doing cellular respiration, which means that we're releasing lots of heat, and we're also not digesting everything or not consuming everything from that level. And so it's released either to decomposers, likely to decomposers, to break it down. And so this, you might be asked to draw sort of a diagram like this, or at least interpret a diagram like this on an exam. And so here you can see there's, this one's in kilocalories. We usually say kilojoules and not so much kilocalories, but this is an energy, it's not a pyramid, it's just an energy diagram, flow diagram. And so there are a few things to note here. So whenever we look at something like this, don't get overwhelmed. Just try to figure out what they're trying to show you. And so they're showing you the amount of sunlight hitting the producers. And so this process here would be photosynthesis. The primary producers are being eaten by the consumers. That's just consuming or eating, and so on and so forth. Now, it does have tertiary consumers going down to the decomposers, but it has everyone releasing down to the decomposers. And then on this side, the release of heat and respiration. And so this gives us the idea of gross productivity versus net productivity. If you've ever gotten a paycheck, you will see on your paycheck your gross amount that you make and then your net amount. And your gross amount is always much bigger because it's before taxes and before any other deductions that you might have out of your paycheck. And so the same thing is true here. So our gross productivity is the amount of energy that was absorbed by the primary producers. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but consequently, we absorb that much, but only, but much of it will be released as either heat or sent down to decomposers. And so if we take that 20,810, which is our gross productivity, we subtract the 13,187 and the 4,250, what we get is net productivity, and that is what's going to be available to the primary consumer. And so you can calculate efficiencies here if you wanted. So I could say we started with 1.7 million kilocalories meter squared per year, and the primary producer added to its body 7,618. And so you can divide those and multiply times 100, and you'll get the percent efficiency. Then that means this 7,618 is what's available to our primary consumer. And so this will then, we remember there's the rule of 10. And so some of it, I don't know if this has been calculated perfectly to the rule of 10, but it has how much is the gross productivity and then what's our net productivity. And so that's subtracting respiration. If you subtract the respiration and heat, that will give you the net productivity. If they've also added 2 decomposers, you would want that as well. But some of that will then, so for instance here, what they've done is they've taken the gross productivity, they've subtracted the respiration, that gives us a 7,618. And then from that number, they said some of it died or fell off and went to the decomposers. So then that's where we get this number, 3,368, which is the gross productivity for the primary consumer. We subtract respiration and heat, and this is how we get the net productivity here. Then they subtract whatever went to the decomposer, and that gives us this number here. And so you can kind of work backwards, figuring out percent efficiencies for each level. And so the net productivity is an important number for knowing how much is actually available to the next trophic level. But the gross productivity is also important for figuring out how efficient is this organism in adding to their body mass. I hope this video helped you understand a little bit about food webs, about energy transfer and transformation, and the herbivores, the carnivores, etc. And also just understanding, remember, we're trying to understand also remembering the processes of cellular respiration and photosynthesis, and then just being able to calculate efficiencies at each level in a trophic level. So we want to know the efficiency from the first trophic level to the second trophic level, and we can calculate how much of that gets passed on based on the amount of respiration and amount of heat released. Again, we can use the rule of 10, or if they give you other numbers, like you'd have to be able to calculate using the numbers that they gave you. Hopefully that was helpful. I'll be back in another video to talk a bit more about the water cycle and the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle, and then we'll go a little bit into the ecological niche concept, and then a bit about keystone species. And that should finish up for our functioning ecosystem topic 1. So I'll see you next time on the next video.